Rangers, forest workers, hunters, and other woods people of Reddit, what is your scary experience in the woods that you still can't explain? My friends and I were high in the woods, deep in the Sierra Nevadas in the California backcountry, and decided to travel a few miles off a path to reach a river and shoot at targets with our .22. The path is littered with deer bones and claw marks from bears, so we're freaking out a bit, but finally make it to where we set up camp. I notice off in the distance about a half-mile upstream the river, there are two men walking towards us in the exact direction we are firing our gun. I yell at the guys for them to stop shooting, and we just watch these men, white-eyed and in their late 20s and early 30s, walking quickly alongside the river when suddenly they both decide to jump in. I should say at this point that the river is moving very quickly and could easily sweep you under, and is definitely not safe for a casual swim. We watch as both the men are swept away towards us downstream. One of my friends, we'll call him Mike, decides to be brave and get close to the edge and extend a piece of wood for them to grab as they're about to pass us. Both the men latch on and Mike is the hero pulling them to shore. When everyone catches their breath, we ask the men what they were doing out here as it's super remote, and they were at least 3 or 4 miles from the nearest trail, and why they both jumped in the deadly river. They give us short answers like, "Oh, we were just having fun, boys, and just free swimming the river," while they're leering at us. Immediately, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and every fiber in my body tells me they mean us harm. We tell them we're going to head back to the trail and they say they're coming with us. Given that we're so far off from civilization and these guys are clearly high on something and a danger to themselves, we reluctantly agree to allow them to follow us. It was the most quiet hike of my life. I felt them trying to feel out if they could take us in a fight. There were 3 of us and 2 of them and we had a .22, but we're young squirrely adults. I don't know how to explain it, but the hike was us constantly positioning against each other with body language without ever directly fighting. They would get close to the gun and try to both be near it, then we would counter by getting between them and the gun as naturally as possible while hiking up a path that was littered in bear claw marks and dung. We finally make it to the car and they decide we weren't suitable targets and moved on. No idea what 2 random guys were doing risking their life in a freezing cold raging river in the Sierra Nevadas, or why they felt the need to size up if they could attack 3 random teens, but I'm glad nothing happened that day. We lived on the Hopi Navajo reservation growing up. My mom and I were feeding the horses very early in the morning before I went to school. It was still almost completely dark out when we hear this low dim humming noise. The horses start acting really nervous, ours included. Sweating, pacing, nostrils flared, eyes showing white, the works. We feed them and walk out from the barn shack trying to figure out what's happened. We look up after scanning the horizon for anything, squinting as best as we could, and there is a black triangle-like thing hovering right over us. It was almost completely silent. It was perfectly over us so you couldn't see it unless you looked straight up, and it felt like it was so close I could touch it. It was pretty damn large too, like a long triangle. Smooth and black. Thinking back, it was actually quite impressive and beautiful. My mom grabbed me and ran back into the shed. This was before cell phones were really a thing, so she just clutched me and told me not to make a sound. We waited for what felt like ages but was probably only 2 to 3 more minutes. The horses weren't even eating, they just paced the shed inside back and forth. Finally the horses started settling down to eat and my mom went outside. It was gone. We felt like we had the flu the rest of the day and I stayed home. We never told my dad. I think it was some sort of military aircraft since around the reservation there are quiet secret military setups, but who knows. Went for a drive in the woods in southeast Alaska a few decades ago. It was my best friend driving, my fiancé riding center seat, and me in the passenger seat of a single cab pickup. We stopped at a gas station to get snacks before heading out. It was late in the evening so it was already dark out by the time we stopped to eat some of our snacks. The night was cool as it was late fall. So here we are chatting in the truck and eating our food parked off of this long winding dirt road to nowhere. My buddy starts talking about local legends and lore including the kushtaka. I was fairly ignorant to the idea and myth and thought it was all BS. I thought it would be funny to harass him a bit about it and push the limits of testing this kushtaka nonsense. He was dead serious when he told me to stop. But I continued. Then I heard what sounded exactly like fingernails tapping on my window next to my head. I looked over and seen nothing but assumed I was hearing things. I couldn't see anything because the cab light was on, it was pitch black out. A few moments pass and I hear it again. This time both my fiancé and friend heard it. My friend sorta nervously smiled and laughed. Then I realized I had to pee. So I jokingly tell them if I get snatched up by this kushtaka, you best come after me. I open the door and pee by the front passenger tire. But the area felt very weird and uncomfortable. I mentioned that as I got back in. Then we talked a bit more and I realized we had pulled off unknowingly. At the time we stopped near a very old small cemetery that contained frog-type headstones of the Tlingit and Haida culture in an area amongst large southeast evergreen trees. I, still not being a believer and love flipping stuff to my friend, then started, yeah well if this kushtaka BS is real, why don't they make themselves known? Come on. Come on already. No sooner than I said that, something punched or hit the front fender twice. My buddy turned ghost white and in one motion started the truck up and threw it in drive and we were fleabing gone. We got off the dirt road and back onto asphalt really quickly and stopped under a streetlight. We got out and looked. Sure enough, you could clearly see where something had hit, up high, the front right fender when we were parked. 2 distinct marks of dirt missing. To this day, I still don't know what it was, but with every other paranormal experience I've had since that time, there's no doubt in my mind that something was trying to tell me to stop pushing it or something bad would happen. Never again did I talk bad about the kushtaka being BS. And I'll never go into the woods of Southeast Alaska alone, ever. So, this happened in 2002, in Brazil. Me and my friends went camping in a forest in the Mantiqueira, similar to the Apalaches. There were 7 of us and everyone brought a gun, pistols, rifles and machetes, not an AR-15, in case we had to protect ourselves from bandits or something like this. We were planning to stay 4 days in the woods. Our camping site was about 1.5 hours from the main road. We made camp in the afternoon and when night came, we lighted a fire, drank, ate, laughed and did everything that's good. Around 1 a.m., it started raining and it extinguished our fire, so we turned our very bad electric lights on when it started. First, the cattle of a nearby farm started making a lot of noise, then the birds woke up and started screaming like crazy. This went on for about an hour, then suddenly, it all stopped. Full and mortal silence. All animals stopped making noise. At this point, we were terrified. With our guns loaded, we made a circle, all of us were in the military, and one of us was in the BOP, a special ops police, unkillable lads, then we heard movement near us. Something was watching us from a near distance. We couldn't tell where because of the noise of the rain. To worsen our situation, one of our electric lights went off, how cliché I thought, we were in darkness surrounded by something in full silence. That's when we heard the scream. I can't even describe it. It was a very high-pitched sound that lasted for a long time, about a minute. Just then, a lightning fell in the woods and for a second, I saw it. A very tall, skinny thing with humanoid traits. It just wasn't human. It had very long arms and black eyes. We then packed up as fast as possible and then ran to the car and left. I didn't sleep for a few nights after that incident. I was about 16 when this happened. I was in Brawley, California for dove season with my cousins, dad and grandpa. I was sitting at our campfire with my cousins when I kept hearing scratching noises and shuffling coming from a nearby cluster of trees. I told my cousins to stay put and I took my shotgun to investigate, thinking it was coyotes and I'll just shoo them away. Well, I approached the trees and I noticed there was some kind of creature or person standing behind one of the trees, but I only could see half of its face peeking at me. I let out a, "Who's there?" And the one thing turned into 6 things, all peeking from behind the trees at me. I panicked, started to fall backward and shot off around towards the trees. I stood up and looked back at the trees and noticed the things were gone. I walked over to the trees, gun still pointed. I saw the tree that I shot, with a small pool of fresh blood next to it. I immediately found the blood trail, and it led to the irrigation canal that was adjacent to the trees. Well, I also noticed that the blood trail continued on the other side of the canal, which was 15 feet across. There were no footprints or anything. So whatever this was, had to jump around 15 feet to get to the other side. It couldn't have walked around the canal, it went on for over a mile. I never told anyone about what I saw. I just told my cousins that I scared off some coyotes. Every year when I went back to that area for dove season, I always wondered if those things were gonna come back for revenge. I love to share a story my uncle told. TLDR at the bottom. In 1992, he owned about 150 acres in a remote area of East Tennessee. On this land, he had a large fishing pond and a stream running through it, and he used to leave lines out at night to pull in big catfish. This pond was accessible by 2 small game trails through thick patches of woods, and he would need to drive to the trail entrances from his house near the front of the property and walk about a half-mile in with his gear and nothing but a headlamp for light. This was something he did pretty often, and my uncle was a lover of the outdoors, so this was business as usual for him. Vietnam vet as well. Anyway, this particular night in July 1992, he went down to the pond at about 9:30 p.m. to check his lines. As he was doing so, he heard a loud splash and assumed it was a fish jumping. He carried on with what he was doing and then heard a low guttural groan and what he described as monkeys flighting just on the other side of the pond. It was about 70 yards across. Multiple loud splashes occurred, and he also heard a loud crash in the woods just yards away to his left. He talked about how he immediately felt a sense of panic and was attempting to get visuals using his headlamp, but whatever was producing these sounds was behind tree cover. He said that the woods then erupted in continued sounds of fighting monkeys, and he opted to drop his gear and run down the trail toward his truck. Apparently, even in his adrenaline-fueled state, he could hear footfall on his left as he was being hunted. He got to his truck and hauled his butt out of there to the road and back to his home, which, mind you, sits on the property about 6 miles away. He went inside and locked every window and door, grabbed a gun, and stayed up and vigilant the entire night, but nothing more occurred. He called my dad the next day, who sort of just laughed it off. Well, for my uncle, whatever he experienced scared him so badly that he put his land up for sale and sold it a few months later. Until he died in 2017, he would maintain that he believes that he walked into a group of sasquatch and they erupted in territorial displays to get him out of there. He never enjoyed the outdoors after that. This wasn't a man who I took for a liar. One time on a hunting trip we were in a tree stand when across the clearing, we see someone standing just in the middle of the field. We grabbed a scope to see what they were doing. My buddy looked at me and said it was a kid. We were in shock that a kid would be out in the middle of the Montana woods in winter, so we climbed down and started heading towards him. Well, as soon as we got about 100 yards away, the kid giggled and took off running the other way. I yelled and started sprinting towards my bud right behind me, but no matter how fast we ran, we couldn't catch him. When we started getting into thick bush, we lost track of him and couldn't find a trace of him. All we kept hearing was his childlike giggle. That's when my buddy just turned and said we should go, something ain't right. We got back to the tree stand and never saw him again. We stopped off to pray and ask some people if any kids were missing because we saw a little boy in the woods, but he ran from us. They said no one was missing from there. It was the closest town to us, so who knows? I've got one. When I was in Boy Scouts, my troop would always go to a camp called Camp Tok for our yearly summer camp. That specific year, they had an abnormal bear activity in and around the camp. It was a pretty sizable camp, but was still way out in the boonies, so an encounter with a chipmunk was just as common as it would be with a California black bear. Wildlife management was done by some crazy old gunnery sergeant that we called Gunny, so you can see the situations you might find yourself in. So anyway, I was tenting with my friend who had just joined the troop, let's call him James. So James and I are sleeping in our tent in the middle of the night, probably around 1 or 2 in the morning, when I was abruptly awoken by something. Everything is dead silent, aside from a plasticky creaking sound. Then I see it, right above my head. Something was pushing the tent in so hard that it began to cave in right above my head, like if someone was leaning into it with all of their weight. Except, these tents were relatively strong, I could as a preteen, could jump on them, and you would just bounce right off. So, being the scared little 13-year-old that I was, I began to smack whatever it was with all of my might, whilst simultaneously clubbing James with my fist to get him to wake up. Mind you, James is an incredibly deep sleeper, so this in effect does nothing. Whoever or whatever it is leaning so hard that it is almost touching my head when James wakes up from the nightmare that he was having and let out a blood-curdling 10-year-old girl being murdered in the woods type scream. Whatever it was stopped leaning on the tent and vanished silently into the night. So, for a few years, James, who has no recollection of the event whatsoever, and I always assumed it was a bear after the meds in my day pack. But, after staffing at the camp and getting to know the lore of the grounds a little better, I think something else might have been afoot. There have been many strange happenings in and around Camp Tok, both paranormal and just normally unexplained. There's the usual Bigfoot and ghost stories, but older scouts and even administrative higher-ups claim to have seen things. Claims of Wendigo skinwalker hybrids, things that look like both, not actual hybrids, some dead guy called Drag Thump, and a bunch of Native American myths. Tokwitz has the biggest and most active Native American program west of Oklahoma. The fact that there were no tears in the tent flap from the bear claws, we were the furthest away from the bear box, the fact that there was absolutely no sound from the supposed bear, black bears make a heck of a ruckus, and the fact that it was just persistently leaning into the tent instead of just clawing at it like most bears, leads me to believe that it was no Yogi or Smokey. It just didn't behave like bears do, and even if it was some older scouts attempting to play a joke on us, they wouldn't have been heavy enough to lean that far in on the tent and probably would have erupted into laughter right afterward. Plus, my troop isn't like that. It's full of a bunch of mild-mannered city boys, perfect Eagle Scout material, of which I am one. Everything just seems so off. I don't claim to know what it was, hence the unexplained part. Let me guys know if something similar happened to you. I was out hunting with my older brother and his best friend a few years back, want to say 2016. We had been walking along a trail for a good 5 km at least. On one side of this trail is a decent drop, and then a river, and on the other side is a decent uphill section and a huge pine forest. It was about 1 a.m. by this point, and we were just sort of quietly talking to each other when a horrific noise split the air. We all froze and looked at each other with the expression on our faces doing all the work. What the fleeb was that? We knew it came from up in the pine forest, and where we are, there aren't any big predators or really anything out there that we should be scared of. So we shouldered our rifles and headed up to find out exactly what made this sound. I wish we hadn't. We got to a clearing and the trees were thinning out, and my brother flicked on his spotlight. Big bright fleeber, excellent range. Way up ahead of us was the strangest looking figure I've seen. Like the general shape of a wolf but just off. It just stopped on the edge of another tree line further up the hill looking right at us. Pacing side to side. My brother's friend and I had our rifles trained on it trying to get a good look. We couldn't count out the fact it was another hunter's dog that was lost, so we, against my gut feeling, went up after it. As we went up after it, it became increasingly obvious this thing was watching us very intently. The closer we got, more we realized this was definitely not a hunter's dog. It was big. Really big, and just the way it moved and its entire demeanor was just so unsettling. We kept 2 rifles on it and one the opposite direction, slowly made our way back down, and haven't been back there since. Don't really talk about it either as we still don't know what we saw, and people usually jump to the same conclusion because like I said before, where we live, there's not really any big predators.